The first tremor hit at 0312 hours, and nobody on Earth knew what it was. Seismic stations from Reykjavik to Auckland registered the pulse simultaneously, a clean, narrow-band vibration at 0.7 Hz, global, perfectly uniform, lasting exactly 11 seconds before it vanished. No fault line ran long enough to produce that signature. No volcanic event could generate that kind of coherence. The USGS flagged it as instrument error and went back to sleep. The European Mediterranean Seismological Center posted a one-line bulletin and went back to sleep. The Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology queued it for morning review and went back to sleep. Dr. Mara Voss did not go back to sleep. She was in the basement of the Berkeley Seismological Laboratory at the time, 4 hours into a shift that had started as routine calibration work and had become something else the moment her arrays lit up like a Christmas board. She was 38 years old, and she had been reading earthquakes since she was 19, and she had never seen a signal shaped like that one. Clean, intentional, like a key turning in a lock. She ran it 3 times, pulled the archived traces, checked for satellite interference, for industrial noise, with a long-shot possibility that every geophone on the planet had decided to malfunction in perfect synchrony at the same moment on the same Tuesday in October. None of that. She sat in the dark lab with the signal playing on a loop and felt the specific cold that lives at the back of the neck when something is wrong in a way that the brain cannot yet articulate. She thought about the uniformity of it. She thought about the 0.7 Hz carrier, deep infrasound, subcrustal depth. She thought about the 11-second duration, which was not a random number. 11 seconds at 0.7 Hz was exactly 7 cycles, a probe, something testing the resonant response of a target. She had read about this in graduate school, in a theoretical context she had never imagined would become practical. Seismic tomography used as a weapons sighting mechanism. You ping a target at the right frequency and listen to what bounces back. Turn signature tells you the internal structure, where to push. She picked up her phone and called Colonel David Reyes at Pacific Command. He didn't answer. She called his aide. She called NORAD. She called 3 people at FEMA and left 3 identical voicemails that she already knew be filed under panicky scientist, pre-coffee. Then she pulled up the return data, the echo that had come back from the crust in the 11 seconds after the signal, and ran it through the software she had spent 6 years building to map subsurface fault geometry, and she watched the image render, and she understood exactly where they were going to hit. The Hayward Fault, the southern section, underneath the eastern bay. And below the fault, something she had not put there, something that had not been there in any previous survey. Buried. Spherical, approximately 400 meters in diameter at a depth of 12 kilometers. Dense, artificial. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she called David Reyes again, and this time she let the phone ring 47 times. He answered, on the 48th. Voss. His voice was the voice of a man who had been sleeping and was not happy about it. There's something under the Hayward Fault, she said. It's not geological. It got there in the last 30 days. I have a baseline survey from September. Someone or something planted a device in the lithosphere and just ran a targeting pass on it, and I need you to get me in a room with someone who has actual authority in the next 3 hours, because the window I'm calculating is not generous. A long pause. How not generous? The targeting pulse was a pre-detonation survey. Based on the return characteristics and the estimated energy density of the object I'm reading, we have approximately 18 hours before they fire the main sequence. After that, we get an induced rupture on the southern Hayward of magnitude somewhere between 9.4 and 11.2, depending on how efficiently the device couples to the fault plane. The eastern bay flattens. The entire peninsula follows within 6 minutes via secondary cascade. The tsunami reaches Hawaii in 4 hours and the Pacific coast of Japan in 9. Another pause. Longer this time. Who is they? Mara looked at the image on her screen. The spherical object at 12 kilometers depth, geometrically perfect, isotopically unlike anything in Earth's crust. She thought about the probe signal arriving simultaneously at every seismic station on the globe, uniform and clean and absolutely impossible. I don't know yet, she said, but they're not from here. The room they put her in. At 0600 at the Presidio, smelled like burned coffee and institutional carpet, and the people in it were making the particular a face that officials make when they have decided a thing is impossible before they have examined it. Generals, 2 undersecretaries, a civilian from an agency that declined to name itself. She put her data on the projector. She walked through it methodically. She had been doing science since she was a teenager, and she had spent 20 years learning to present findings in a way that gave authority figures the minimum possible room to misunderstand. She did not embellish. She did not editorialize. She let the numbers speak. When she finished, the unnamed civilian said, "The object you've identified could be a previously uncharacterized geological formation." "No," Mara said, "it could not. The isotopic signature rules that out. The geometry rules that out. The fact that it wasn't there in September rules that out. Your September survey could have missed it. My September survey has a resolution of 50 meters. A 400-meter sphere at 12 kilometers depth would not be missed." General Harmon, who was the ranking officer, and who had the intelligent eyes of someone who had survived 3 decades of institutional nonsense, said, "What do you need?" "I need to get something down there. A borehole vehicle with a payload. I need to place a counter-resonance emitter at the device's contact depth. If I can match the return frequency of the fault plane and inject a phase-shifted signal, I can break the coupling before the main detonation fires. The fault won't rupture. The device fires into acoustic noise. And if you can't, then the Eastern Bay goes into the ocean, and we find out how good our early warning systems are." Harmon looked at her for a moment. "You're talking about drilling 12 kilometers in 18 hours. 16 now. That's not possible. Standard drilling, no. We have a military bore vehicle at Lawrence Livermore that was built for deep emplacement of seismic sensors in hardened granite. It does 4 kilometers per hour under field conditions. You have 3 of them. I need all 3 running parallel bore paths to triangulate my injection point." The unnamed civilian started to say something about jurisdiction and authorization chains. Harmon said, "Get them moving." They gave her a team. She had not asked for a team. She had specifically said she needed equipment operators and a signal engineer. But the Army sent her Captain Eric Strand, who was 32, had a jaw that looked like it had been assembled from leftover parts, and who handed her a cup of actual decent coffee at 700 and said, "Walk me through what you need me to do and I'll do it." That was enough. She walked him through it. The bore vehicles arrived at the deployment site, a parking structure on Foothill Boulevard in Oakland that had been evacuated under a cover story about a gas main. At 9:30, they were ugly machines, squat and armored, their drill heads the size of compact cars, their drive mechanisms loud enough to feel in the sternum at 30 meters. The operators knew their vehicles. They did not ask questions about why they were drilling through an Oakland parking structure into the bedrock underneath. Mara appreciated this. She had not accounted for was the second pulse. It came at 1100. Same frequency, same duration, different purpose. Not a probe this time. A communication, or what her software interpreted as one. A structured signal. Repeating. She ran it through every pattern recognition algorithm she had, and got nothing. Because she did not have a reference frame for the language, the structure was there. Deliberate groupings. Pauses at regular intervals. Something trying to say something. She showed it to Eric. He looked at it for a moment. "What are they saying?" "I don't know. But they sent it 4 times in a row." "Warning shot," he said. "What?" "Before you start a demolition, you send a warning. Make sure everybody clears the area." He looked at her. "They're not hiding what they're doing. They're not trying to surprise us. They sent the targeting pulse at 0310, and now they're broadcasting on every seismic channel we have. Whatever they're doing, they want us to know it's coming." Mara turned this over. "That's worse." "Yeah," he said. "It is." The political problem arrived at 1200 in the form of Undersecretary Lawrence Price, who had driven from Washington to the Presidio in a government SUV, and who walked into Mara's makeshift command post with the energy of a man who had decided what he was going to say before he'd opened the door. "The UN Security Council is convening," Price said. "There's a parallel signal being received at stations in Moscow, Beijing, and Geneva. The same broadcast you're reading. There are 17 governments currently interpreting this as first contact and recommending non-engagement, meaning we do not take any action that be read as hostile. Mara said, "The action they're calling hostile is me preventing 3 million people from dying. The action they're calling hostile is using military hardware to interfere with what might be a diplomatic overture. It's a weapon. It's buried 12 kilometers under Oakland. It's going to fire in 6 hours. We don't know that. I know that." Price looked at General Harmon. "The secretary is asking for a stand down." Harmon was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the Bohr vehicle monitors, where the depth readouts were climbing toward the 6-kilometer mark. He was looking at Mara's signal data she had printed and taped to every flat surface in the room. He was looking at a map of the Bay Area, with population density overlaid in red. "Tell the secretary," Harmon said slowly, "that we have a significant equipment malfunction and we're working to resolve it." Price's face did something complicated. "General, thank you for your input, Mr. Price." Price left. Mara looked at Harmon. He was refilling his coffee and not meeting her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. We've got 6 hours. 5 hours and 40 minutes, as it turned out, because at 13:20 the third pulse arrived, and this one was different. The frequency had shifted. Instead of 0.7 Hz, the carrier was now 1.4 Hz, exactly double. The duration was the same. The effect was visible in the accelerometer data before the signal even finished. A measurable compression of the fault plane. A pre-stress event. They were loading the spring. Mara watched the stress data spike and felt her timeline collapse by 40 minutes. She pulled up her Bohr vehicle feeds. Bohr 1 was at 7.2 kilometers. Bohr 2 at 6.8. Bohr 3 had hit a dense gabbro intrusion at 6.1 and was running 2 kilometers per hour instead of 4. Eric was next to her. He had been next to her for 8 hours, and he had not complained once, and he had not second-guessed once, and she was deeply grateful for that, even though she wouldn't say so because there was no time. "Bohr 3 isn't going to make depth," she said. "I know. Can you do the injection with 2? The triangulation is the whole mechanism. 2 points gives me a line. I need 3 points to define the plane. The injection has to be precisely planar to the fault surface or the phase cancellation doesn't work. 2 vehicles, I'm guessing, at the fault geometry. You built the best fault geometry model in the world. I built a model. Models are approximations." Eric looked at the screen for a moment. He picked up his radio. "Bohr 3 operator, this is Captain Strand. What's above your current position on the drill path?" The operator's voice cracked back. "Parking structure foundation, sir. 6 meters of reinforced concrete, then open air," Eric said. "Can you reverse the drill head?" A pause. "Sir, reverse up instead of down. 4 kilometers per hour going up. Drill through the concrete and come out the parking structure floor." "Captain, I don't." "Confirm you understand the question." "Yes, sir. Technically the drive system is reversible." Eric looked at Mara. "If the vehicle comes up through the floor, can you mount the emitter on the drill head and run the injection from ground level? Aim down instead of up." Mara stared at him. She ran the geometry in her head. The fault plane was not horizontal. It was inclined at approximately 70 degrees, dipping northeast. If she could calculate the ground surface point that sat directly above the optimal injection node. "Yes," she said. "Give me 4 minutes." She ran the calculation in 3. The point was 231 meters northeast of Bohr 3's current position, in the middle of Foothill Boulevard. She told the operator. He moved. The Bohr vehicle came up through the asphalt of Foothill Boulevard at 14:48, its drill head emerging in a fountain of pulverized road material, and a sound like a cathedral falling, and the traffic on the street, which had been supposed to be cleared, and was not entirely cleared because it was Oakland, and clearing Oakland takes time, swerved and honked, and one woman filmed it on her phone, and the video would later get 40 million views. Mara ran out to the vehicle with the emitter unit in her hands, and Eric running beside her, and they spent 11 minutes mounting it to the drill head housing in the open air, on a public street, while a Berkeley traffic sergeant tried to wave them out of the lane. Fourth pulse hit at 15:03. The frequency had shifted again, 2.8 Hz. The fault plane stress reading jumped 12%. Mara felt it in her feet, A low, sustained vibration that was not quite sound, felt in the soles and the back teeth and the inner ear. Around her, car alarms went off. A water main 2 blocks away so failed, and water began sheeting down the gutter. She was still wiring the emitter to the power coupling. Eric said, "What happens if it fires while you're connected to that thing?" "I'd rather not think about that. I'd rather know." She looked at him. His face was calm. He was not asking out of fear. He was asking because he was the kind of person who needed the operational picture to be complete. The injection emitter runs at a resonant amplitude that matches the fault plane's return frequency. If the device fires the main sequence while I'm still calibrating, the fault plane couples to the device signal. The ground motion amplifies. The emitter, being directly coupled to the fault plane at that moment, would receive that amplified return. She paused. It would be bad for anything near the emitter. "How near is bad?" 80 meters. Eric keyed his radio. "All personnel, 200-meter clearance from bore 3 immediately." "This is not a drill." He looked at her. "How much more time do you need?" 7 minutes. "How much time do we have?" She checked her stress model. "Maybe 12, maybe 8. The loading isn't linear, so 7 minutes is fine. 7 minutes is fine if nothing changes." Things changed at 15:11. The signal shifted to 5.6 Hertz and the fault plane stress reading didn't jump. It spiked. It went from baseline plus 12% to baseline plus 64% in approximately 4 seconds, and every accelerometer Mara had in the ground registered a pre-rupture microtremor sequence that she had spent her career hoping she would never see outside a simulation. The device was beginning its firing sequence. She looked at her wiring. 3 connections left. The first 2 were standard couplings. The third was the resonance calibration lock, required a 45-second handshake between the emitter and the bore vehicle's signal processor. 3 connections, 45-second handshake, and the fault plane was already moving. She felt Eric's hand on her shoulder. Not pulling, just present. "What do you need?" "I need quiet and 30 seconds. He did not speak. He stood beside her, blocking the wind from the east. And she understood then that this was a practiced thing. That he had stood beside other people in other moments of exactly this kind. The moment when everything depended on one person's hands and steadiness, and his job was to make a perimeter. Not to help, not to advise. Just to be there so she wasn't alone in it. She made the third connection. She started the handshake sequence. The ground moved. Not a shake, a roll. A slow, deep, nauseous roll. The kind of motion that the body recognizes as wrong before the mind has words for it. The asphalt around the bore vehicle cracked in long lines, spider webbing outward. A streetlight swayed and held. 2 blocks north, something large. A building, a parking structure, she couldn't tell. Made a sound like a groan amplified to the scale of a mountain. The handshake counter read 22 seconds remaining. "Mara," Eric's voice, calm, just her name. "I know." She watched the counter. The ground rolled again, stronger this time, and she grabbed the bore vehicle housing with her free hand and held on and kept her eyes on the screen, where the counter was descending, and the stress readings were climbing in parallel, and it was a race between 2 numbers. She had built her whole career on the proposition that data was not the enemy, and that if you understood the physics, you could find the window. There was always a window. The universe did not seal its doors. 8 seconds. The micro-tremor sequence peaked. The fault plane locked. She saw it in the data. The moment of maximum stress before rupture. The held breath before the scream. And she understood with the clarity that only comes at the edge of disaster that she was either right about the physics or she was wrong, and there was no third option. 5 seconds. She pressed the injection trigger. The emitter fired. What happened in the fault plane at 15:17:32 was technically a wave cancellation event. The emitter projected a 5.6 Hertz signal at calculated phase inversion into the rock at the device's contact depth, and the signal met the device's own output, and the 2 waveforms interfered destructively, and the energy that had been loading into the fault plane since 0312 that morning had nowhere to go. It dispersed. It scattered into incoherent vibration at a dozen different frequencies, none of which was sufficient to propagate rupture. The fault did not move. The device, deprived of coupling, fired anyway. It had passed the threshold of its own sequence and it could not stop. But It fired into a fault plane that was no longer resonant, and the result was a magnitude 4. One earthquake centered at 12 kilometers depth under East Oakland, which rattled windows and knocked some books off shelves, and was reported in the morning news as a minor seismic event, notable only because it was slightly deeper than the usual Hayward Fault activity. Mara sat down on the asphalt next to the bore vehicle. Eric sat down some next to her. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The water from the failed main was still running down the gutter. The car alarms were still going off in the middle distance. Someone's radio, somewhere, was playing a song she didn't recognize in a language she didn't speak. "Is it done?" Eric said. "It's done." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How'd you know the phase inversion would work?" She thought about this. It was a genuine question, not a challenge, and it deserved a genuine answer. "I didn't," she said. "I knew it should work based on the physics. Physics is a model of reality. Reality doesn't always read the model, but you did it anyway. What was the alternative?" He didn't answer. He pulled a battered metal flask from his jacket pocket and held it out to her. She took it, drank something that turned out to be very good bourbon, handed it back. "Where'd you get that?" she said. "I have priorities." The device did not go quietly. Mara had hoped. She had genuinely hoped, in the small frictional rational compartment of her mind that remained optimistic even under catastrophic circumstances, that the wave's cancellation would simply neutralize the device, short out its mechanism, leave a 400-meter metallic sphere, sitting inert at 12 kilometers depth, eventually to be the subject of the most extraordinary archaeological dig in human history. What happened instead was that the device, denied its primary function, executed what she would later describe to 3 successive congressional subcommittees as a secondary discharge. Recall. It took the energy it had stored, the months or years of whatever charging process had loaded it to detonation threshold, and it radiated it. Electromagnetically, in a tight upward beam. The beam was not damaging. It was not a weapon in this configuration, but it was visible. A column of pale violet light rising from the ground on Foothill Boulevard at 151732, coherent and vertical, and visible from San Jose to Sacramento, lasting approximately 9 seconds before it extinguished. The video of it got 400 million views. And then, because the universe has a sense of drama that Mara had never fully appreciated until that moment, approximately 22 seconds after the beam extinguished, the response came. Not a seismic signal this time, not a probe. A focused electromagnetic pulse, narrowband, aimed at the bore vehicle's position. Aimed, she would realize later, at the emitter specifically, at the device that had canceled their weapon. It washed over the equipment and accomplished nothing because the emitter had already completed its function and its circuitry was cold, but the signal itself was structured, repeated, in a way that, for her pattern recognition algorithms, flagged as non-random. She was sitting on the ground when she picked it up on her phone. She looked at the waveform. She looked at Eric. "They're talking to us," she said. "I figured." He looked up at the clear October sky. "What are they saying?" She ran the signal. She ran it 3 more times. The structure resolved into something she could map against a probability model. Not language, not yet. Nothing she could decode, but information theoretic structure. Complexity in the right range. Signatures consistent with intentional communication, and one element that was different from the rest. Repeating, isolated, clean, frequency, 0.7 Hertz, the original probe frequency, the same note the whole thing had started with. "They're asking a question," she said. "Which one?" She thought about it. About a probe signal sent simultaneously to every seismic station on Earth. About a pre-detonation survey that had announced itself openly. About a targeting pulse that had broadcast on every frequency they monitored, like someone knocking loudly at a door instead of picking the lock. "They wanted to see if we'd notice," she said. "They wanted to see if we understood what they were doing." Eric was quiet. "They fired the device on a countdown they gave us," she said. 18 hours. 3 escalating pre-pulses, they were telegraphing every step. And then after we stopped it, they asked. They came back to the original frequency and asked. She stopped. The logic of it was settling into place like the last term of an equation. They asked if we'd done it on purpose, whether it was accident or understanding. And what do we tell them? Mara looked at the emitter, still mounted to the Bohr vehicle's drill head. Its housing dusty from the road material, its couplings jury-rigged with zip ties, and a piece of wire she'd pulled from the signal processor harness. She looked at Foothill Boulevard, cracked and flooded with water main water, strewn with debris from the Bohr vehicle's emergence. Police tape flapping in the wind 100 meters in each direction. She picked up her phone and opened the signal generation software. She had built it for seismic research. She had never imagined using it for this. She set the frequency to 0.7 hertz. She held the phone up to the sky for a moment, which she knew was pointless. The signal would need to go through the Bohr vehicle's transmission array, not her phone's speaker. But the gesture felt right. And sometimes a gesture is the most honest kind of answer. Then she went to the transmission array, and she keyed in the frequency and she set the duration to exactly 11 seconds, and she fired it. One pulse. One clean, 0.7 hertz signal, 11 seconds long, ascending, not a threat, not a weapon. Just, we heard you, we understood, we're here. The response came 44 minutes later. A full transmission, hours of structured signal that would take 17 months to partially decode, and decades more to fully understand. 17 governments would eventually participate in the translation effort. The work would produce 3 Nobel Prizes, 2 international treaties, and 1 doctoral dissertation that changed every field it touched. But at 1600 on that October Tuesday, sitting on the hood of an army vehicle on a busted stretch of Foothill Boulevard with a cup of cold coffee and a man she'd met 9 hours ago, Mara heard the beginning of it come through the ground array, and she felt the weight of what it meant and did not try to name it yet. Eric said, "You saved 3 million people. The physics saved 3 million people. I just understood the physics. It's the same thing." She drank the cold coffee. "You know what bothers me? Tell me." They chose the Hayward Fault. Could have chosen anywhere. The New Madrid. The Cascadia subduction zone. But they chose the Hayward, which is under one of the most densely instrumented seismic zones on the planet. On a planet that has been obsessively monitoring its own ground movements for the better part of a century. She looked at her screen, where the translation effort was already beginning, where the first faint structures of something like a message were emerging from the noise. I think they chose the place most likely to be noticed. The fault where someone was most likely to be watching closely enough to understand what they were doing. Eric thought about this. So the whole thing was a test, maybe. Pass or fail. She looked up at the sky, perfectly clear, blue all the way to orbit, giving nothing away. "I think," she said carefully, "that we answered." Congressional hearings were 3 months later. They were long and contentious and politically complicated, and Mara testified at 6 of them, and at every one she said the same things. The device had been real, the threat had been real. The intervention had been plausible. 40 years of seismic research investment that multiple administrations had tried to cut. And she would recommend in the strongest possible terms that the world continue to invest in understanding its own planet, because the universe was paying attention, and it had not yet decided what it thought of them. What she did not say at the hearings. What she saved for the paper she published the following year in a journal that she'd had to create, specifically for the subject matter, was the thing that kept her up at night in the good way, the way that was not fear but wonder. The signal had not come from orbit. The signal had not come from space at all. It had come from 12 kilometers below the surface of the Earth, through the lithosphere, through the mantle, in the form of a seismic transmission of incomprehensible precision. Whatever had planted the device had not been visiting. It had been here. It had been here, Mara calculated based on the isotopic halo around the device's position, for approximately 4 million years. Watching, learning the planet, building a vocabulary from the planet's own language, the language of tectonic stress and mantle convection, the deep-time grammar of a world writing its own history in stone. And then, when the planet had grown something interesting enough to communicate with, they had knocked, loudly enough to be heard, gently enough not to break anything. If the something interesting was paying attention, humanity had been paying attention. That was, Mara wrote in her conclusion, either a very good sign or the beginning of a conversation that would require extreme care. She wrote, hoping for both. Eric Strand came to find her the day the paper was published. She was in the basement of the Berkeley Seismological Laboratory, which was where she was most days, in front of the same array that had lit up at 0312 on that October Tuesday. The signal was still coming. Not the original pulse, not the escalating pre-detonation sequence, something quieter and more complex that her algorithms were slowly learning to parse. "You're still listening," he said from the doorway. "Still talking." She didn't turn around. "The transmission rate is about 3 bits per day in terms of what we can decode. At current rates, it'll take approximately 4,000 years to receive the full content of the initial message." 4,000 years, give or take. He came in and stood next to her, looking at the screen. She had printed the signal traces and taped them to every flat surface in the room, which was how she thought. Visually, spatially, the data spreading outward from the center until the pattern emerged. "Is that enough?" he said. 4,000 years to get the message. She thought about fault planes and resonant frequencies. She thought about a signal crossing 12 kilometers of solid rock in 11 seconds. She thought about whatever it was that had sat in the lithosphere for 4 million years, patient beyond imagining, building its vocabulary from the slow, deep language of the planet it had chosen to watch. "For them," she said, "think 4,000 years is a short conversation." He nodded. He pulled out his flask and held it out, and she took it without breaking her gaze from the screen. "What do we do in the meantime?" he asked. She listened to the signal moving in the deep ground beneath her feet, patient and immense and entirely alien and entirely present, speaking in a language she had spent her life learning to read. "We listen," she said. "We get better at listening. And why try to be interesting enough to be worth talking to?" The signal ran on, steady and deep, 0.7 hertz. The frequency of a question that had been asked in the dark 4 million years ago, and had finally, 11 seconds at a time, started to receive an answer. Outside, the city moved through its morning. Traffic on Telegraph Avenue. A siren 2 miles north. Somewhere a dog barking at something it had heard before its owner could. The ground held. For now, the ground held.